In this video, we're going to discuss how to operate on Excel workbooks in VBA. In the previous lectures, we have already discussed how to refer to a workbook. The basic method is to say that workbooks, this is the keyword, parenthesis, and then quote the name. For example, if you're trying to refer to a workbook called Book 1, then you can just say Book 1, quote, parenthesis. That's a reference to Book 1. As I mentioned before, sometimes it's a little bit safer to say that book1.xlsx. In other words, it might be safer to include the file extension in your reference. To activate a workbook, for example, if you want to activate Book 1, then you can just say that workbooks Book 1 dot activate. So this activate method will activate that workbook. This is useful when you have multiple workbooks open at the same time. If you only have one workbook open, then that workbook is automatically activated, so you don't have to do this. If a workbook is activated and you want to refer to that workbook, then you can simply say active workbook. That will refer to the currently active workbook. Remember, there can only be one currently active workbook at a time. So this is unique. The other useful way to refer to a workbook is called this workbook. This workbook refers to the workbook where your VBA code is inserted. If you want to start a new workbook, then you can just say workbooks.add. Okay. So here both are keywords. You don't have to change anything. Workbooks.add will start a new workbook. To save a workbook, you can refer to that workbook and then say .save. Remember, to use .save, your workbook must have already been saved before. In other words, it needs to already have a name and a location. In that case, after you make changes, you can say workbook.save. Okay? If this is a new workbook, meaning you haven't saved this workbook before, then you cannot do .save. You have to do .save as. So after you start a new workbook, to save that for the first time, you have to say .save as. And in .save as, you have to provide two things. One is the location where you want to save that workbook. The other is the name which you want to give to that workbook. So here, path and workbook name, these are placeholders. You have to replace them with the actual location and the actual name. If you want to save a workbook where you have your VBA code inserted, then you cannot just do workbook reference.save as and then the location and the workbook name. You have to add one more parameter. And this parameter specifies that this workbook will be saved as a macro-enabled workbook and the file extension will be XLSM. To close a workbook, you can just say .close. To open a workbook, you say .open, but here you have to provide the location and the name of that workbook which you want to open. Okay, now let's look at one example. In order to run this code, you first need to start a brand new workbook, which is empty. Okay, let's do that. After you start this workbook, let's open the VBA editor, Alt F11, and we're going to insert our module here. And then we're going to copy our code into this module. Okay, now let's run this code using F8. The first line says workbooks.add. That means start a new workbook. So here you can see after I run the first line, there's a new workbook opened up. And this is automatically named Book 2. The second line says worksheets 1, which means the first worksheets, range A1, that's cell A1, and we're going to change the value to a new workbook. So you can see that's the new workbook. Remember, in this line here, I did not refer to the workbook name. And when I do this, Excel will assume that what I mean is the currently active workbook. So right after you add this workbook, which is book 2, this workbook will be active. So book 2 is the active one. That's why this sentence is added to book 2. And if you want to more explicitly refer to that active workbook, then you can add active workbook in front of the worksheet. Okay, let's do that in the next sentence. So we're going to put this sentence in A2. Okay, so that sentence goes to A2. In this case, this active workbook dot can be omitted because even when you omit that, Excel will assume that you mean the active workbook. The next sentence says active workbook save as. So here, we're going to save our workbook as newbook.xlsx. But first, we have to replace this path, which is a placeholder, with the actual location where you want to store your file. I'm going to go ahead and choose my location. So your location depends on your own computer. You can pick a folder in your computer. Yours is probably going to be different from mine. So now, the book 2 will be saved as new book XLSX. So you can see that book 2 does not exist anymore. We have new book.xlsx. And this file will be stored in this location. So in your case, like I said, you should pick a different location based on your own computer. So now we're done with this file. We're going to go ahead and close it. Finally, remember that our code here is actually stored in book 1, right? So in order to save this code, we have to save book 1. And also, we have to save book 1 as a macro-enabled workbook. Okay, so let's do that. First of all, before we save that, I'm going to demonstrate how to use this workbook reference. Remember, this workbook always refers to the workbook where this code you're running is inserted. So in this case, our code is inserted in book 1. So this workbook refers to book 1. Now I have book 1 and my VBA editor side by side. Okay, so let's run this line. You can see this sentence is put into cell A1. And finally, we're going to save this workbook by the name book with VBA. And because this is a macro-enabled workbook, so you have to add this extra option here. Okay, this cannot be omitted. You have to add this extra option. Again, I need to replace this path with the actual location. So I'm going to run this line. So now if you go back to the file, which was book 1, you can see that the name has been changed and it has been saved, which means your code has been saved. And we're going to end this file. So that's our example. And of course, if you want, you can also add a line here that says this workbook.close, so that after you run your code, this file will automatically be closed. So once you understand my example, and you should go ahead and try this mini project. This is not very difficult. We basically use all the stuff we have just learned to perform some simple tasks.